Okay, we are in Luke chapter 18 tonight, looking at the parable of the persistent widow, and it goes from Luke 18 verses 1 down through verse 8. So let's just begin by reading it if I can. All right, let me make it bigger. Luke 18 verse 1. Then he spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray and not lose heart, saying, there was in a certain city a judge who did not fear God nor regard man. Now there was a widow in that city, and she came to him, saying, get justice for me from my adversary. He would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, though I do not fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. And then the Lord said, hear what the unjust judge said. A little further down, verse 7, and shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? Okay, a shorter parable. And this one, he actually helps us out a good bit because, sometimes the parables you're kind of left wondering what the point of it is. And this one, he tells very clearly what the point is. That's how the whole thing starts, that men always ought to pray and to not lose heart. But let's go ahead and get into our questions. The first question is, let me go ahead and go back there. The first question is, what is the context of the parable and how might that apply to the parable? Anyone want to help us out with that? Remember what I said last week. Number one rule of Bible study is context, context, context. So, what's the context of the parable and how might that apply to the parable? Don't everyone speak at once.
Is it about persistence?
Okay? But what's the context? You got to look around it.
Get too difficult.
You got to look right before he gave this parable. There's a point of him giving the parable. When you look right before it, from verse 20 down through verse 37 of the previous chapter, does anyone's Bible have a heading there for what we're talking about?
No, not this one.
Because what it is the destruction of Jerusalem.
Mhm.
That's the destruction of Jerusalem, and also a portion in the parallels talking about Judgment Day itself. And so you start looking at that back half of the first century, and those Christians are going to be hard up against it. They're going to be facing all sorts of persecution. And of course, they'd already been facing persecution concerning things along the lines of like the Judaizers and the Jews. You think about what Saul of Tarsus had been doing to the church, things like that. So the Lord is pointing to this back half of the first century. You might notice there in verse 37, they answered him, where, Lord? He said, wherever the body is, there the eagles will be gathered together. Most people think that's talking about the Romans surrounding Jerusalem. And so you think about how that would apply to chapter 18. Then he spoke a parable to them that men always ought to pray and not lose heart. Well, why would those first century Christians be losing heart? And it was an extremely difficult time. So you might think about the persecution. You might think about time having gone by, right? And I think that's the point of why do you have to be persistent? It's because time time has gone by and the Lord works in his own time frame. And we're the sort of people, because we're people, we want things done now. We want things done now. And it's like, no, that's not how this works, whether it's the destruction of Jerusalem or whether it is Judgment Day. It's like the Lord works in his own time frame. And you might just think about how things were difficult. Do you remember when we went through the churches of Asia in our study of Revelation and how concerning the Roman persecution, how it was tied with economics, and that if you didn't bow down to certain pagan gods, you basically couldn't do business, so it was affecting their livelihood. It was affecting every facet of their life up to and including life and death. Um, and so it's not a surprise that the Lord would say, men always need to pray and not lose heart, because that's exactly what was going to happen, that men were going to lose heart. And the same thing can still happen. So that's a little bit of the context. Any questions or comments along those lines? All right. You might be thinking about one of the questions. Well, we might actually come back to that question. Sheila, did you have something or?
No,
Oh, okay, that's fine. I know you're either in the car or somewhere. They're on their phone, but appreciate them joining in. The second question was, and this goes, within the parable, you have this contrast being made between the unjust judge and God. So explain the contrast. Why does the unjust judge help the woman?
Eventually.
Eventually. Okay, so why does he help her?
She's driving him nuts.
For his own benefit.
Go ahead, Nancy, expound
I
on that.
mean, really, it's true though. She's driving him crazy. She won't leave him alone. So I think he just wants to quiet her down.
Right. He says, because this widow troubles me, I will avenge her. He did not fear God nor regard man. Verse 4.
Sounds like a
So,
terrible judge.
do what?
Sounds like a terrible judge.
Well, he does do something. And that's the contrast. He does. He would not for a while, verse 4.
Mhm.
He would not for a while, but afterward he said within himself, okay, I don't fear God, I don't regard man, but she is pestering the life out of me. And so, lest she continually comes to me and wearies me, he gives in. Now, here's the point. Why does God avenge the elect? And my point is that the judge, and it's the Lord's point, the judge does this just because she's pestering him.
Mhm.
Now, why does God do it?
Because he loves us.
Because he loves us.
Mhm.
And so, shall God not avenge his own elect who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them, pardon me. And he loves us, he cares for us, he is not unjust, right? This is the unjust judge. That's the contrast. Well, God is not an unjust judge. He's a very just judge. And I think one of the points we might make is there in verse 8, I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Now, does that mean, again, he does things in his own time? And I'm kind of curious. Let me look real quick. Or anyone else? Do you have a translation, different translation, New King James or New American Standard or the ESV? What word does it use there? So I don't have to look it up. There in verse 8, I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Is
quickly.
quickly. Okay. Um, quickly is a relative term, and it's still in his time, and he will avenge them, and we might think about that idea as well. And that's actually before we get to it, the point the Lord is making is God is so much better than this judge. So if this woman's not going to give up on the judge, and so it's like, why would God's children give up on God? And the sad thing is, and we'll talk more about it, the last verse shows that it actually will happen, sadly, but we'll talk more about it. The third question tonight is, what was the widow seeking? And then the back half of it is, what does Jesus promise God will do? What was the widow seeking?
Justice.
justice. And what does Jesus say God will do?
Be a just God.
Will he not avenge his own elect?
Yes.
Um, do y'all know what the imprecatory psalms are?
No.
Anyone ever heard that phrase?
Yeah, it's
The imprecatory psalms are the ones that are very somewhat negative. Negative, and it's where David is seeking, he wants God to avenge him. And he is asking for God to, frankly, smite, um, to God, for God to smite his enemies, for example, and things along those lines. But the imprecatory psalms are those psalms that are crying out for justice, that are appealing to God who avenges, here as that word is used. We know from Romans, Romans talks about how we are to do good, and this is a difficult concept because, we talk about being holy as God is holy, but at the same time, we are called to imitate the Lord. But there are exceptions, and this is one of those exceptions. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves. This is Romans 12, verse 19. Do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him a drink. It's that verse. We are to be like the Lord, but this is the exception. Vengeance only belongs to the Lord. Vengeance does not belong to us. That is the Lord's territory. So, as we think about the Lord avenging, sometimes that's hard for us to get our minds wrapped around that the Lord would do that and that we can even ask for the Lord to do that. You see it occasionally in scripture. For example, in Revelation, I think it's those talks about those under the throne who cry out to the Lord and they say, "How long? How long?" You have that verse. You have Paul. Do you remember when Paul talks about a certain Alexander the coppersmith? And he says, "May the Lord repay him for the harm he has done." And that's pretty strong language. When Paul talks about the Judaizers, he says that he wished they would cut themselves off, that they would mutilate themselves using their own figure, if you will. But that's pretty harsh language to ask for the Lord who avenges to do exactly that. And you're asking for justice, and you're asking for the Lord to act, and that's the widow comes to the judge, and the widow wants justice from her adversary, and the Lord avenges his own elect who cry out day and night. Anyone have any thoughts about that? That's sometimes hard to get our minds wrapped around because everyone wants to hold hands and sing Kumbaya, frankly. And some of those psalms are not Kumbaya psalms.
Mhm.
Some of those psalms are pretty harsh. I've actually heard people talk about some of those psalms, and they basically say that David was wrong for writing them.
Wow.
And I don't think so. I don't think it was any more wrong for David to write them than it was wrong for Paul to talk about Alexander the coppersmith, that it was wrong for the widow to come to the judge and say, get justice for me from my adversary. And you wish you didn't have adversaries in life and you wish people would do the right thing, but sometimes people are not interested in doing the right thing. And it's in the Lord's hands. And that's exactly where it should be. Any questions or comments up to that point? All right, we're moving right along tonight. Question number 4. What does the latter half of verse 8 point to? I tell you, he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth?
Judgment Day or the end of the world, one or the other.
Okay, and Bruce, what do you think when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? What's the point of that?
Will you find those who believe, who are faithful?
And what's the truth of the matter?
There will be many that will not be
Right.
faithful and fall away.
And that's the sad truth. And it is a sad truth. You know, when they come to Jesus and they say, "Are there few who are saved?" And the Lord answers it, but to put it in a nutshell, the Lord's answer is yes. That's right. There's only a few that are saved. It, and all through Scripture, it has been this way. It is always the remnant. It's always the remnant. And it is that can be a depressing thought. And I think you can tell from the Lord's words there is a hint of being downcast a little bit. It's like God will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth? And, you know, you might think about the destruction of Jerusalem, and it's like the Lord had been working on them and just doing everything he could to get them to believe that Jesus was the Christ. For those who believed Jesus was the Christ, those folks got out of Jerusalem because that's what Jesus said to do. When you see the eagles gathering, you get out of town. But a whole lot of folks didn't. And because of what was happening in the first century, a lot of folks who did walk with Jesus fell away. And thought we might consider a few different passages, or just a couple different passages. One of them is actually, well, let me get it up in front of y'all. I want to look in Matthew 24, and Matthew 24 is actually, I believe, let's look to make sure. You might notice Matthew 24 is the parallel of this. And so this goes hand in hand very much with what we're talking about. And so you have discussion of the destruction of Jerusalem, the abomination of desolation. And then you also have Judgment Day and various things like that. But then you have this quote, and I've actually gone too far already. You have that quote in verse 12. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. And that's just the truth of the matter. That's what was going to happen. Because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. Doesn't mean that they had not loved before, but the love of many would grow cold. You might think about Revelation 2, the church in Ephesus that left their first love. You might think about some of those other churches in Revelation, those who thought they had a name, they thought they were alive, but they were in fact dead. Church in Sardis, the church in Laodicea, who was very prosperous, but they didn't love the Lord. They loved themselves. There's other passages in the New Testament that talk about the same sort of thing. And so and what I was thinking of, there's a passage in Galatians. So here the Lord is talking about how men always ought to pray and not lose heart. This is Galatians chapter 6. Galatians chapter 6 at verse 9. It says, "And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart." That idea. Let us not grow weary while doing good. The question I had for you that I thought we might discuss with our time left is, why would someone grow weary in well doing? Why would you grow weary in doing good?
Takes effort.
Okay, it just takes effort.
Some people-
It's a whole lot easier to just believe.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
Just believe and you'll be saved. Um, it's a little harder to actually work, to actually do. What else might you say? Actually, before we move on, that idea of effort, you know, there are times where our effort, and what I'm thinking of is in the garden. Jesus says, "Watch and pray." And they wouldn't even do that. It says that they slept, but it gives the reason for their sleep. It says they slept out of sorrow. And there may be different reasons why our strength is diminished. You might think about old age and just you grow weary in doing good. Um,
You'd grow weary in doing anything.
yeah. So that's now. So what's the answer to that then? What do you got to do?
Pray a lot
You better pray,
and do
and
what you can.
you
God
got
doesn't
to it.
expect us to do what we can't do. We have to do
Right.
what we can. And there's ways that people that like are old and can't get out and do a lot, there's still lots of ways to do good. You
Yeah.
know, they can get online. We have so many different ways these days that you can contact people and, talk with them and encourage them and find out if they need anything or
Sure.
uh, send cards. There's a lot of ways, things that people can do that, maybe they think they're useless, but they're not.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. What other thoughts do y'all have?
I
Go ahead,
think
Brenda.
I think our expectations can sometimes be too high if we're expecting a lot of fruit to develop from our efforts.
Okay. When you're trying and you just when the Lord comes on the disciples who had been fishing and he says, "Have you caught anything?" And what's their response? We've been fishing all night and we ain't got nothing. Um, you might think about how discouraged they were at that. And there were times, when Paul was in, oh, where was he in? He was in Thessalonica before he goes to Berea. And doesn't it say that he was only there for like 2 Sabbaths or something like that, like 2 or 3 Sabbaths? And it's like he's only there for 2 or 3 weeks. And it was just and you can tell reading the account, there is a reason he moved on, but he moved on pretty quickly. And you would hope that more people would respond. And when people do not respond, it can be discouraging. Um, and that's just the truth of the matter. You wish people would respond. It's like Samuel when, and I know I refer to this all the time, when they come to Samuel and give us a king, and Samuel is so discouraged. And God says, they haven't rejected you, they've rejected me. I'm not sure if that made Samuel feel better or not, but that was the truth of the matter. Samuel wished they would have listened, the same as Jesus wished Jerusalem would have listened. I would have gathered you together like a hen gathers her chicks. You were not willing. It's like he wanted them to listen. You just think about different ideas. When Jesus heals the 10 lepers, how many of them came back and said thank you?
One.
Just one. And he was a Samaritan. He was a foreigner. And Jesus points it out. It's like the foreigner came back and said thank you. And you can just read between the lines and you can tell he's just like, really? Really? 9 of you are healed. 10 of you are healed, but only one comes back. When he feeds the 5,000 and the next day when they're looking for more food and he starts talking about the food. He starts talking about his flesh and his blood. And in verse 66, many of his disciples left. And the Lord turns around to the apostles and he says, "Do you also want to go away?" And that would have been so discouraging to see the crowds, leave. That would have been horribly discouraging. Then you just have individual accounts. Jesus and the rich young ruler. It's like, well, if you want to be perfect, sell what you have, give it to the poor, and come follow me. If that's really what you want, this is what you need to do. And the man went away. That would have been horribly discouraging. Um, and then the Lord turns around and he talks to the disciples and he uses it as an object lesson. But to Brenda's point, when you're out sowing seed and you're doing what you can, but it's fallen on the wayside or it's fallen on the rocky ground or it's fallen among thorns. And That's just the reality. And reality sometimes stinks. That's the point. That the widow, it's like the Lord will avenge the elect who cry out to him. Nevertheless, when he comes, will he really find faith on the earth? Nope, the love of many will have grown cold. Okay, so we've spoken about um just age, you're just tired, talking about, the lack of success, frankly. Go ahead, Pat.
I was just going to say that, um, and I think this is more prone for young people or new converts that they can have a lot of temptation in the world, and I think that can cause you to grow weary of well-doing. You can lose your faith, when you start letting temptation enter in and you start giving into it.
Do you think the problem is they face more temptation, or they just don't know how to deal with temptation, or they choose not to deal with temptation?
Probably depends on the person.
Mhm.
Because I was just thinking, we're about to read David and Bathsheba. And here David is, and David looks at Bathsheba and lusts after her and ends up sleeping with her. And you would like to think, um, I'll just say it. Most commentators think David was about 50 when that happened. This was not a youthful lust anymore. He was a little bit of an older man. Now, she may have been very young, and that may have played into it. But I guess my point is, and it may be that, it may be that as we age, we face
Mhm.
different trials, different temptations. Um, what we better do is we better put down roots. We better put down roots and we better grow.
Mhm.
Um, I think the parable of the sower speaks, when you have the four groups and you have the wayside, the wayside, it goes in one ear and out the other. You have the rocky ground where it's real shallow rooted. Both of those, I would suggest, happen so quickly. And you just think about young people or anyone. It's just if it goes in one ear and out the other, it's a picture of giving up, especially that shallow rooted one. That's a picture of giving up very quickly.
Mhm.
The devil knows what he's doing. You might also think about something else that plays a factor in all this, and this may go along with Pat's first point, just time. It may go along with the second point too that Brenda made, but just time. Time passes. And it's one thing. We better look at the race of faith. I know it sounds trite, and maybe it is trite. We better look at the race of faith as a marathon and not a sprint. I mean, it's one thing to run a 100-meter dash. Even I could run 100 yards if I had to.
I might run 10 feet.
But 26 miles? It's like you better buckle up for the long haul. And time time has an effect on people. And sometimes folks give up just in the passing of time. I think the Lord talks a good bit about that. People looking for the Lord's return and they mock. Doesn't it say, how is it, First or Second Peter? There will be mockers who say all things continue as they were from the beginning, but this they forget that with the Lord 1 day is as 1,000 years. Right? It's a time factor. So you might consider that idea. You might also think about it can be easy to grow weary in well doing when it's only a remnant, when it's just a few. I mean, it's
Mhm.
when it's a small congregation, right? When it's just a few, it can be real easy to give up. If you got hundreds or thousands, like, oh, you're all gung ho and. But when there's just a few of you and a couple guys are gone, so one person has to do the announcements and the opening prayer and lead singing, and another person has to do the Lord's Supper and the scripture reading. When
Mhm.
there's only a few, when there's only a few, it can be easy to grow weary in well doing. It's always been a remnant. It's always been a remnant, and just the fact that it is a remnant you got to get past numbers. When Peter and James and John and the other apostles, when they saw however many of those 5,000 leave, it would have been very easy to follow them out the door. They had to get past the numbers and say, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." It's not about the numbers, it's about you and following the truth. Go ahead, Brenda.
I also think it's a lack of confidence and a lack of, a lack of self-esteem as well. They don't feel like they can really do much, but it's
Okay.
because they haven't grown like they need to. They haven't matured in the word like they need to. Because if you grow in the word, then by rights, you should be able to go teach a class or to go talk to someone about the
Right.
gospel.
Right. Talk to your neighbor. To that we might think about the parable of the talents and that one talent man. It's like the Lord gave him that one talent based on his ability. He had the ability, and yet what does he say? Oh, I knew you to be an austere man and to gather where you haven't sown, so I went and buried it. I didn't do anything. And to Brenda's point, it's like he did not have the confidence in his own ability to use that talent. And if he would have used that talent, he would have grown. And so yeah, a lot of folks they think they're useless. Nobody's useless. And it's at the very least you should know why you became a Christian. So anyway, any other comments or questions or any other ideas about why someone may grow weary? Why did Solomon grow weary?
Too many wives.
Definitely.
He tried to please too many women.
Yeah, and the problem wasn't necessarily because a lot of kings had multiple wives. What was the problem?
Idolatry.
That was the problem. It was those pagan wives. That was the problem. So we might think about the effect of family, and it's easy to grow weary when you have a spouse. When you have a spouse that's chirping in your ear, when you have children who are trying to pull you away from church, things along those lines. You can tell when Solomon talks about better to dwell in the rooftop of a house than, or better, what's he say, better to dwell in the rooftop than in a house with a contentious woman.
Mhm.
And they were much like the persistent widow, only the persistent widow was looking for justice. And Solomon's 700 wives and 300 concubines, they weren't looking for justice. Uh, they were looking for something else. But nonetheless, they were still persistent in their nagging. And family can do the same thing. Any other comments? All right, well, I think that's about everything I had for tonight. Just the point of the parable, men always ought to pray and not lose heart, that we cannot give up. You might, you might also think about how this applies as a teaching principle to those who believe in once saved, always saved. What's the point of the parable if you really cannot lose heart?
Good point.
The very fact that you can lose heart and you need to be persistent shows that, yeah, it's like we can lose our salvation. And so we cannot give up. We have to be persistent. We have to cast our cares upon the Lord. All right. Appreciate y'all. Anyone have anything else?
Mm.
All right. Take care this week.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Appreciate y'all being on here. Y'all take care. Have a good week.
Have a good week.